Well, it's Tuesday, and that means we're still doing electrics. And I know this is maybe getting a little old. We've been doing electrics for a long time. And so here soon, I'm going to change the subject back over to scales and gauges or something. We'll do something a little different. We'll take a break and then come back to it. But today, we're moving on to something within electrics that's maybe the most interesting thing about electrics, and that's diodes. I've mentioned when we were talking about reverse loops that you can automate reverse loops. And there's a whole bunch of different ways to automate reverse loops, especially if you're doing a DCC railroad. But if you're doing a DC railroad, the easiest way to automate your reversing loop is with diodes. So what exactly is a diode? Well, if we go all the way back to our original discussion where we said electricity is a little bit like water flowing through a hose or a pipe or something, think of a little flapper valve inside the plumbing there. And if the water's coming up against the flapper valve, if there's just the slightest amount of pressure, then poof, it opens the valve. It takes a little bit of pressure and then it just opens. And then the water will flow through there. Once it's open, it's open. There's no like halfway or anything. I mean, there is a little bit, but for the most part, it just opens. It's either open or it's closed. At a certain point in time, though, if you keep pushing current through there, the whole thing will just catch fire and reward you by melting down and going up in flames. But let's say instead we're pulling our DC power from the other side, and it's coming up against that valve. Well, you're not going to open the valve. It just simply resists, and you put more pressure there, it doesn't care. The valve is just simply closed. So it's a really neat little one-way valve. It takes a tiny bit of voltage to open it, and at that point, current will just simply flow through it in a binary kind of way. Either it's flowing or it's not. And if you apply more current through there, it just keeps passing that current through up until a point where you exceed the capability of the diode to pass current, and then it burns up. So how can we use these one-way valves? How do we use them in model railroading? Well, one of the earliest uses, these things came along in the late 1950s. And if you remember, we talked about before that, almost all model railroads ran on AC, because in order to convert AC into DC, you either had to hook an AC motor to a DC generator and generate DC that way, or you could use a vacuum tube, a great big huge vacuum tube, which was very expensive. So the easier solution was to use a variable transformer, something called a variac, and it would just vary the voltage on the alternating current. And then as long as you put alternating current motors in your trains, it would just run. Well, with the advent of diodes, a new use comes along with those, and that's something called a rectifier. You can, if you take two diodes and you run AC into them, if you think about it, when the current's flowing one way, it'll go through the diode and out as a DC current. When it's coming the other way, it'll go through the other diode and out as a DC current. The back voltage can't get through because the diode won't let it come through. That's called a half-wave rectifier, and that's a really cheap way to generate a pulsating DC, and all of a sudden you had DC power packs that could go out with train sets that only cost, like less than $1 to manufacture. So suddenly the world was awash with two-rail DC train sets that all ran on DC. Now the half-wave rectifier has a cousin, and that's the full-wave rectifier. And because diodes have gotten so cheap, there really is no reason to do half-wave rectify unless you have some specific reason to generate this pulsating electricity. So what a full-wave rectifier is it's 4 diodes. And if you look at it, when the current is coming in from this side, it'll flow down and out this way. The return voltage from the DC circuit can come around to the other diode and flow back with the alternating current in the other direction. When the alternating current flips to the other side, now the voltage can travel from the other diode back up to the DC out, and the DC current can return to the neutral in the AC through the other diode. So now you get an almost pure DC. It's still bumpy. It still has peaks in it, But for the most part, it's just regular DC coming out of this full wave rectifier. So there's a whole bunch of fun things we can do with full wave rectifiers, and we're going to dive into those uses over time here. One of them is you can put them inside your passenger cars so that the lights don't flicker. You can do that by taking a full wave rectifier like that and putting it in the car. That way, no matter what polarity the electricity is coming in on the DC, the voltage coming out of the rectifier will always be the same voltage. You can then feed that to a capacitor, which will charge up, and that will smooth out your lights. So that's a really slick system. But one of the fun things we can do in automating a reverse loop is, if you think about it, a reverse loop, the polarity on your whole railroad is changing back and forth based on the reversing of your transformer. So one of the things you can do is put a rectifier in your reversing loop. Now the reversing loop will always have the same polarity, no matter how the reversing switch on the transformer is set. You can pull your train into the reversing loop, and as soon as the train's into the reversing loop, just throw the reversing switch on your transformer. And as the train's coming out of the reversing loop, it will be facing polarity in the opposite polarity, and it'll just come right out of there and go back the way it came. And that's how I had my old railroad automated, was that way. So we'll do a deeper dive into how to use full wave rectifiers to automate reversing loops. So that'll be a fun upcoming thing. Now, another really interesting thing about diodes is, if you look at how the diodes are built, there's two wafers inside. There's a positively charged silicon wafer and a negatively charged silicon wafer, and they're in contact with each other. And when the electricity matches the polarity of that gap, that junction between the two, electricity flows. If it's coming against the polarity of that, then electricity can't flow. But even in the earliest days, the people researching these diodes realized that another byproduct of the electricity crossing that gap was a tremendous amount of light. But you couldn't see the light. We don't see it in normal diodes because they're sealed in plastic, and so the light couldn't get out even if you could see it. But you can't see it because it's infrared. It's not in the visible spectrum. It's below the visible spectrum, off the red end of the spectrum. But scientists being scientists, they kept messing around with this and adding, I don't know, arsenic and old lace and other things. I'm not sure what all they were adding, but they were able to bring the color up. And they finally got it up into the visible spectrum, and suddenly they had a red light. They'd glow red because they just barely got it up into the visible spectrum. And they called these LEDs, light emitting diodes. So they still sealed them in plastic, but now they sealed them in clear plastic so that the light, you could see the light. And so all of a sudden the world was flooded with red LEDs. They kept messing with it and messing with it and messing with it, and they got it up into the green spectrum, and that meant that they passed through yellow to get to green, and they continued up. And the last one, and it hasn't been around that long, is blue. They finally were able to get blue out of light-emitting diodes, and that meant that they could do all kinds of magical things with all kinds of different colors. In fact, I'm willing to bet that whatever device you're watching this on right now, it probably is using a matrix of little teeny tiny LEDs to create the color image, because you can do that now with LEDs. Anyway, LEDs can be used for all kinds of fun things in model railroading because they can be made quite tiny, so you can use them as a light source in the tiniest of locomotives. You can put marker lights on an N-scale locomotive if you want to, because they can be amazingly tiny. But you have to keep in mind the whole time you're using them that they are not light bulbs. They sort of look like light bulbs, and they sort of behave a little bit like light bulbs. But a light bulb, you give it a little bit of current and it comes on, and then it gets brighter and brighter and brighter and brighter, and it burns out because you're overpowering it. An LED, remember, is just this valve. It just opens. It's binary. It's either on or it's off. So there isn't a lot of dimming that can be done with an LED in its natural state. They just sort of come on. Of course, if you overpower them, just like a light bulb, they will burn out, but they don't really get much brighter. They just kind of sit there on, and then when you cut off the power, they go off. They're either on or they're off. They're a binary thing. And then, of course, if you run the current through them backwards, they don't come on at all. So that means that there's all kinds of fun, weird little magical things that can be done with these in model railroads. So anyway, we're going to be talking extensively about how to use LEDs in models. And they're a little bit different because, again, they're not a light bulb, and you can't really treat them like a light bulb. But that means that you can do some things with them that you can't do with a light bulb, but there are things you can do with a light bulb that you can't do with an LED. Anyway, you want to follow along with all of this stuff, so you certainly want to be a subscriber to the channel. And the easy way to subscribe is to click on the upcoming blue button. Right there, the blue button. Well, we're not sure how you found this video on the internet. We hope you found it entertaining and not boring, and hopefully maybe informative. And we will see you on Sunday because Karen and I have some fun stuff to show you. We'll see you then. Bye-bye.